Good day, everybody. This is a talk about a new validation framework that's on CPAN. There weren't enough, so I decided to do yet another one. So what is Valiant, right? And why bother? Because aren't there a gazillion like validation systems on CPAN? Let me turn my camera off. Probably don't see my face. Hang on. Okay. And I've used quite a few of them. I've used Form Handler. I've used FormFoo. Data move form. I contributed to several of them, and over the years, I always found that there was something like that didn't quite work right for me with the way I build applications. So I finally built my own system around the way I work, based on looking at several other frameworks, including Perl frameworks, but also frameworks in other languages to try to just generate ideas. And I'm going to show it off. Show you what I've done with it. Hopefully, if it looks interesting to you, you might consider using it in your next project. So what is Valiant? So a lot of validation frameworks are kind of heavy-handed. Like you have to define either an object that specifically only does validations. For example, like Form Handler. Form Handler, you're building an object that defines how the validation works, right? Or other systems might have a configuration file, or they might be built up from like a hash graph or a bunch of a bunch of configuration information. So in other words, these, for the most part, they stand alone. What Valiant tries to do is it just tries to simply integrate with commonly used objects in Perl, like moo, moose, and dbx class. And the idea is that you basically just basically puts validations into the systems that you're using. So this is just an example of it. I'm using moo here, but again, it could be moose, and I'll show you dbx class later on. Those are the ones I've integrated with. I'm happy to work on integrating any other system. I even tried integrating with Karina, but I found a lot of problems with it compatibility-wise. I'm happy to try if somebody's an expert and wants to help me. Anyway, so what does it look like? Basically, you just declare your object the way you hear in this case a moo object, just like you always do. You use moo, you declare some attributes, maybe methods and so forth. But then all you simply do is you say that you're using the Valiant validations as part of this. So when you say use Valiant validations, it imports the validation, a bunch of keywords, such as validates and validates with, and a few others. And it also modifies the way it looks at the object, which we'll see later on, so you could do even more integrations. But in general, what happens here is that you declare some validations, say a validation on the name or a validation on the age, and the validations can be any number of things. But in this case, I'm using pre-built validations like length, which is the length of a string, or numericality, which basically it does validations on numbers. And when you go to make the object, you can then run validate, and you'll get either that it's successfully validated, that the object was created properly, or you'll get a list of error messages. Okay, so basically it's a domain-specific language for tagging moo, moose, and moose and dbx class objects. And the idea is that it basically glues those bits directly into the stuff you're working on, rather than forcing you to create a separate sort of like validation like system. And what it not is, it's although Valiant does include form building as a side package, it's not built into it, right? It's just simply doing validation. So unlike, for example, like say, again, HTML form handler, where it's validations and form generation all built into one thing, it's just sort of very focused. I could probably remove this. I'm actually using it in production at this point. Okay, so what's a simple validation look like? Let's just start from the top. So again, you just like any other moo or moose object. Most of these examples are going to use moo, but it would be identical if you're using moose. Okay, and it would work very similarly even if you weren't using moo or moose. Just obviously, if you don't use moo or moose, you don't have attributes, right? So that would be one thing to be different. But in general, most of the bits would be the same. So how does it work? So the most simple validation, you have a keyword called validates with, which accepts a subroutine, and what ends up happening is the object gets created and populated. And after the object is created, when you call validate, it will run all the validations that have been defined for that object. And then what ends up happening is, in this particular case, I have a anonymous subroutine that's associated with validates with, and it gets the instance, any options that might have been passed to your call to validate, which we'll talk about later. And you could just simply write code to define what it should be. So in this case, I'm just simply by creating a subroutine and very simply just defining validations on particular attributes, or we'll see you could also do validations on the model as a whole, right? And so like in this case, I'm saying, okay, the name has to be less than 20 characters and the age has to be greater than 1, right? And so I create an object called simple, which is going to fail the validation. And when you run it, you'll get errors. The object gets created, but it doesn't die, but the errors get recorded so you can call them for display. So that, just to step back for a quick second, sometimes there's a confusion between like what I call well-formed and valid, right? So like if you're using Moo or Moose or some other systems, as you know, you can put type constraints, which are just, I know they're not real types, and that's going to, and I know Will has very strong feelings about what a type is, but in those cases, when you're running something like that, and you go to create the object, if you're applying constraints like that, the object just doesn't create and it returns, it dies, right? The application dies out. And that's because in those scenarios, the information that's being passed to the object is so bad that you can't proceed. When you're doing validations, it's a different sort of use case, right? Your use case is you're collecting the data, and it's well formed in the sense that you can that it can fit into the spots that you want it to be, but it is somehow not valid. And instead of just simply dying and just blowing up the application, you want to collect issues and errors with what's been passed in so that you could do something about it. Typically, as we'll see with the demo, you might report it to the user and say, there's things here, problems with the data you typed in, and here's what you need to do to fix it. So when I'm talking about valid, I mean that the document doesn't conform to an expected specification, but it's acceptable that the application can gather that data, right? In other words, the data is not so messed up that it's got to just like die and throw its hands up and just return to the user and say, major system error, don't know what to do. Okay, so again, when something is not well formed, it means that it's so broken that you can't even validate it. So an example of that might be somebody might be like hacking your API and passing completely improper data. Maybe data that's too big or data that doesn't look at all like what it's expected to be, right? In which case you're just simply returning like a bad request. I'm not even going to try to understand what you're doing. On the other hand, if somebody's passing data that basically fits into the slots and what you would like to see, but perhaps, for example, the data is too long because you want to fit into a database that only accepts 20 characters, for example, for a particular string, then you want to collect errors on it so that you can tell the user, hey, you got to reduce the size of what you're typing in. This is a very common use case, and I'm sure you all have ever run into this. Anybody who's done web development has run into the use case, particularly with user forms. Again, when something is invalid to the perspective of Valiant, that means that it's a state that's acceptable, right? You want to catch it and inform the user client about it, as opposed to just simply stop processing. It's a bad experience for your clients if they go to type in a form and they hit submit and you just return bad requests. Well, they have no idea what they did wrong, right? You want to inform them of the problems. That's one example. So just going back, probably be easier. So just again, to show you, here's the definition. So we're saying name has to be less than 20 characters, age has to be greater than 1, and we go to create it. And this is, this is an example where you're passing in data that generally fits the expected interface, but is not fitting within your business rules, right? So you create the object, and the object gets created fine, doesn't die, doesn't kill out. You then call validate, and at that point, you know if it's valid or invalid, and you can get error messages. When you use Valiant, it creates an attribute on the object called errors, which is an object that contains all the errors that have been collected for that validation. And that object has lots of methods and different ways of getting at the errors. One easy way is to say, I just want to dump all the errors into a hash ref so you can see them all in one go. But we'll show you later, I'll go later, but if you can get errors on specific fields and other things. Okay, so going back, so like the example we gave, the very simple example, just again to quickly look at it. I mean, this is fine, and you could always just do this. And I always like to make it so that people can drop down into Perl and just simply write Perl code to do what it needs to do. But we all admit that there's a lot of very common types of validation work that we do all the time, in which case it's really nice and to be able to have ways of putting validations of specific attributes and then creating methods that could be reused to do validations. So this is an example of that. So here, instead of using the validates with keyword, I'm using the validates keyword. Validates keyword expects an attribute like a moo or a moose attribute name, or for dbx class, it'll require a field name. This method has a couple different signatures, but one signature is simply accepts a anonymous subroutine or a subref. They're allowed to have parameters. And so you can create, for example, methods, subroutines that can automatically, that you can then reuse in different places. So in this case, this is the exact same thing as I did before, but instead of just creating a single method that munches all the validations for the object into one big long method, I've broken it up into two separate methods that hopefully could be reused on other projects. So this validation we're looking at here, it's exactly the same thing as this one. Let's go back to this one. It's the same rules. So greater than 20 and age greater than 1. In this case, well, I set the age to 5 here, but basically when you do it this way, you can parameterize it, so it gives you a little more flexibility, right? If you have methods that you're calling, you may not want to just hard code all the bits. You might want to make it so that people calling your methods can parameterize it a little bit, right? So it ends up doing the same thing, but gives you more flexibility. All right. So when you use the validates keyword, you're allowed to put in as many validations as you want. So you can chain them as you have here. So basically, it accepts an array of validations. So that way, if your attribute or whatever it is you're validating has several pieces of business logic, and again, for good reuse, you probably don't want to create one method that just validates with everything all munged together. You want to be able to validate things separately so that you can get good reuse. You can certainly do that. So here's, in this particular case, I'm running a check length and then some made-up methods, something that looks like a person's name, perhaps. Maybe you might want to even hit the database to see if the name's in the database, right? Okay, so on the flip side of it, if you have a validation that applies to several attributes, validates can take an array ref. So in other words, if you have a validation like check the length has to be no more than 20, you can just apply that to an array ref so that we don't have to repeat it over and over again. So the validates keyword takes one or more attributes that you're validating, and you're allowed to put one or more validations on it. Now, you might, at some point, you might want to think you prefer to be able to create your validations. You might have custom validations and you want to put them in in a place that can be reused. In this case, you just simply inherit. You use the Valiant validator role, and then you can simply create a custom validation that you can then simply apply, as we'll see. You can simply apply to your object. So again, this is exactly the same thing as we've been playing with. It has a minimum age, minimum length, and it has a valid. And this is how you would use it. Going back to the validates with. Remember, we noticed before validates with can accept just a subroutine ref, but it can also accept the name of a custom validation. Then this would have to be the name of the class. They would then go look it up and do the validation for you. So Valiant, it gives you a lot of different ways of creating validations for reuse, depending on what makes sense for what you're doing. So in the end, a validator class is just any class that does a validate method. You can use the Valiant validates role because it gives you some helpers and so forth, but you don't have to. And when you're looking Valiant, when it's doing resolution for your custom classes, it looks at quite a few different namespaces. So it has it'll look at a namespace based on the project that you're working on, and then some namespaces that are reserved specifically for CPAN for the Valiant project. You can always, if you have a very specific name, like you need to put in a full namespace, you can always do that by putting a plus in front of the name. So we've been talking on and off about attribute validation, but just to go back to it. So it's nice to be able to say, all right, I'm going to just, I've shown you how to create custom validators. I've shown you how to say you can just create a subroutine reference that does your validation. But there's a lot of validations that are common, and Valiant comes with a bunch built in. So you get quite a bit of functionality out of the package without having to write any validations at all. And I just would encourage you can go to MetaCPAN and look it up, and there's the whole list of validation that comes with, but it's got all the common ones. What I did is I looked at like all the validation frameworks on CPAN, and I made a big list of all the validations that were common and to all of them that people seem to want, and I just replicated them across the board. So presence is that it's basically a required field. Numericality is just validations about numbers. Length, validations of length of a string. I have date validations, so you can specify things like it has to be in the future or it has to be greater than a certain date. Again, all these custom validations that come with Valiant are documented, and you can see them, and you get all when you install the Valiant package, you get them all by default. Okay, and if you want to build your own, package like that, you can just inherit. So you can consume the Valiant validator each role and do a method called validate each. If you go look at the source code for each of the custom validators, you'll see that I'm basically implementing validate each, and that just gives you an easy way of creating your own. So in this case, as an example, I'm creating a validator that requires the value to be true. As we know in Perl, true is the value can't be 0, it can't be undefined, right? Otherwise it's considered true. So this is a very, very simple one, and this is how you would use it, right? You would just call true. So again, it would look it up. So just to go back to the name, it knows to look under my app. If my app is your namespace for your project, it'll look under my app validator for your validators, in addition to looking up the namespaces defined. So it does that list of 5 namespaces get checked automatically. So again, I went through, I not only looked at Rails, I looked at like some JavaScript frameworks, I even looked at Java stuff, in addition to like all the most popular ones on validator frameworks on CPAN to try to get an idea what people really wanted. So hopefully it comes built in with things that you need mostly. I'm happy to like entertain if people do pull requests. add more. The only thing I ask is that I'm trying to keep the validators that come with Valiant. I kind of want them to be pure Perl and easy to install, and not like increased number of dependencies. So if you want to do something that requires like an XS module or something, you can use the Valiant X validator namespace and ship it separately. So that my goal with Valiant is to try not to increase the number of dependencies. It's already a project with quite a few dependencies, so I would prefer to not add more. And again, I'm trying to make it easy to like use, like reuse stuff that's already on CPAN. So like if you have validations written in like type tiny or like type standard or any of the older like move space type constraint systems, I've done my best to try to integrate it so you can just simply use them. If I'm missing one that you use, let me know and I'll try to add support for it. But this is a case of like I'm reusing the int type constraint, which comes with the type standard package. In order to, of course, as you see, and I already have a numericality one, but if you're used to using like say type standard or type tiny or one of the others, and you have a bunch of like custom type constraints, then it's a handy to be able to reuse it without having to build any more of your own custom stuff. Now, I also tried to make Valiant flexible from the perspective of inheritance and consuming roles. So like in this scenario, you have a package starting all the way on the right. You have a package called retiree, which extends person and extends the role is retirement age. So if you go then move over toward the left, you see that the is retirement age role defines one validation on age, and the base class person has an age and a name, and it creates some validations on name and age itself. Okay, retiree would get all of them. So if you're building validations, you can use this as another method of composition in order to improve your reusability. So the goal here again is like for the validations not to be some new separate like thing that sets aside. It just sort of like slides into your existing objects. So it's just an example of how it would work, right? So if your age is 24, you're not a retiree. And that's defined here, right? I'm saying your age needs to be greater than 64 if you're using the is retirement age. Of course, we have to change that to 67 now for a lot of us. Okay, so when you use a validator, there are a lot of built-in options to give you flexibility again in using them. I'll go over a bunch of them really quickly. The first one is allow undef. So allow undef can be applied globally, as it is here in the name validator. Validator. So what does this mean here? If I'm validating name, and it's got a format, it requires to be alphanumeric, and it's got to be a length between 3 and 20 characters. But if there's no name passed, don't bother, okay, to do validation. So in other words, allow undef. If you don't pass a name, it doesn't run either one of these validations. When it's applied globally, which means it's applied to all the validations you've created. In this particular case, I'm putting allow undef directly on a specific one. So why might you want to use this? A lot of times you might have an attribute like, for example, name that has several validations. One of them might be it's required to be present. Another one might require it to be greater than a certain number of characters and less than a certain number of characters. When you run that, if somebody doesn't pass the name, you would get both errors. Must be present, and in addition, you would say must be between 3 and 20 characters, for example. Now you might think that that's redundant, like to show the user, right? So if I have a presence required validation, then I'm not going to bother, and that one fails, and let's just not bother to do any of the others, right? So then the user gets one message saying it's required. Yeah, it just gives you some control over it. So that's what allow undef is. Allow blank is identical to allow undef, but it allows an empty string. And this is actually a really common scenario in web forms, because like if you use using a web form system, and somebody submits, but they leave a field blank that's required, you don't get undef, you get an empty string. So basically, allow blank is the same as allow undef. It accepts an undef, but it also fails on blank as well. So you'll see that might be a very common one you might use for creating a validation on web forms. If or unless, a lot of times you might want to say don't bother to validate under certain criteria. So here's an example, validating the password. I'm requiring the password to be at least 12 characters, but no more than 32. And it's also using a validator that's checking to see if it's a secure looking password. That subroutine probably does stuff like does some analysis on the text to make sure that it's a secure looking password. But maybe the boss doesn't have to do that, right? So you might have some custom criteria that say don't bother to do this validation under these criteria. So that would be if or unless. The validators automatically have some default messages for what the errors should look like, but you might want to make it easy to override. So you could just simply pass the message attribute, and you could just make whatever message you want. Now, Valiant also builds in a whole separate system for resolving internationalization. I'm not going to go into detail in that. It's covered in the documentation, but there's a couple different ways that you can override the default messages. This is the easiest way, but you can also create YAML or JSON strings that define how the messages should look in different languages. So yeah, message takes a string, a code ref, or a translation tag. Another attribute is strict. Now, I meant what I said before was that in Valiant, when you fail a validation, that validation gets listed on the errors object, but it doesn't actually die, doesn't kill the object creation. There might be scenarios where you want to, and you could just simply say strict equals 1, and then that validation will act in that manner. If it fails a validation, it won't even let you create the object. It has some limited use cases, but it can have some value. Okay, on. So a lot of times you might have validations on your object that run in different scenarios, right? So on allows you to say, to define that this particular validation runs in a particular context, right? So like here, person. If you're running in the voter context, they need to be 18 or greater, at least in the United States. If they're running in the retiree context, they need to be 65, which I guess is now 67. If they're running in the centenarian context, they need to be 100, right? And those are basically ways of controlling how and when these particular validations run. So how do you invoke a particular context? So you just simply pass it. When you can run validate context, you can then send the context parameter, and what it'll do is it will automatically know which one to run. So this can be really handy when you have a lot of really complicated logic around your validations. You need to have them run in different scenarios. This is quite common on web forms as well. You may have behavior that runs differently on update versus create. So just to go back to it here. So like I'm creating a person whose age is 50. Okay. If I validate them if I just say validate, it's true. Just go back to look at the code. So I didn't pass the context, right? So none of these would have run. So that's totally fine. Then if I'm passing the retiree context, what ends up happening is this. You pass the retiree context, it says on voter. Oh, I'm in the retiree context. So I don't run this. I don't run this validation. On this one, it does match it. And so in which case it does run this validation. It has to be 65 or older. And this one gets skipped as well. So then looking at this code here, it would give you an error. You need to be greater than or equal to 65. In the voter context, I said you were 50, so that would have been true. And the centurion context, you're only 50, not 100. Okay. So if a validation specifies an on, okay, then it must match whatever is passed in the context. The context is allowed to pass a single context or an array of contexts, array ref of contexts. So if the validation specifies it, it's got to be passed, it's got to match. If the validation does not specify an on, that means it will match anything, okay? Whether it's there or not. So I'm not going to go again into super detail because the errors object has got a lot of methods, but just basically when you add errors to the errors object, you can query them in different ways. You can get all the messages at once, or you can get messages that are associated just with the top level model as opposed to like messages that are associated with particular attributes. You can get messages formatted with a larger name, or you can get, say, for example, you just want the messages for a particular particular attribute. This ends up being handy when you're, for example, building web forms where you want to get the errors for a particular field that failed validation. Okay, so I'm not going to, these are some things I'm not going to talk about. I'll talk about the nested stuff in the debug section because it's useful there. I mentioned internationalization and filtering. It's too much to cover in this talk. I mentioned internationalization a little bit before. Filtering is a lot of times when you're getting data that's being inputted from the user, whether it's a web form or some other system, you need to scrub it in some manner, right? So since that's a useful use case, Valiant has some features for doing filtering of the incoming data. So it has features for doing things like trimming white space from the beginning and the end, or normalizing the capitalization and so forth. Okay, it's there. It's covered in the docs. And if you're doing it for web forms, you probably want to understand how it works because it's most usefully for that. If you're having trouble with Valiant, you can just do Valiant debug and a number starting with 1 and going up to 10. The higher the number, the more data you'll get out of it. So if you're having trouble when you run and you don't understand why particular validations are running in the way they are, you can put it into debug mode and get data out of it. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about debug's class. So let's go to the, let's look at a code example because you're probably all tired of looking at slides. Let's go over to that. So I'll stop this. I'll just present this screen. It's probably easiest. Shout out if it's too small. I know, Will, you'll probably shout out if it's too small, right? Okay, so let's look at a application. So here's an application that's using Valiant for validations for its forms. Let's look at a form. So a pretty familiar scenario, right? You have a form for people to register, first name, last name, email, password, and you want their password to be confirmed. So if I don't, put anything in there, here's below the errors. Oh, excuse me. Didn't get enough sleep last night. Okay, so to give it some stuff. So I'll do this. This should to show you the password confirmation, which is another built-in validator that you get. So I'll put in like A, and here I'll put in B, and it gives you that. Now in these cases, it's common for when the password fails to not put it back in. It's just a security thing, but you could do it any way you want. Anyway, so let's look at the source code for that. So in this case, I am using this application uses DBS class. And there's a person object which defines all the fields that we were looking at, the email field, the name, password, and some additional bits that aren't part of the validation. So for those of you who play with DBS class, okay, that's all pretty common. I'm defining the columns and some relationships. So here are how the validations work. Now in DBS class, you generally you call everything using the package method, package keyword. But if you're using like DBS class sugar, which I'll show later on, you can call it without it. So make it look more like the movie examples. But otherwise, it's pretty identical, right? So I'm creating a presence. All these things are required. Email is required. Password is required. Given name is required. All these bits are required. Links and so forth are required. I'm requiring the email to be unique. That's a validator that comes specifically with the DBS class integrations because it actually does a database lookup. What am I doing here? There's a little difference worth talking about. Make this bigger so you can see it. Okay. So I'm creating two validations for password. Okay, and they're very similar. For the first one, I'm doing it on the create context. So when you're using Valiant with DBX class, if you do a create, it automatically sends it as a create context for you. And the same thing with updates. If you do an update, it sets an update context. So it makes it easy for you to make validations that only apply to the field, either in a create or in an update. Okay, so that's what's happening here. And here I'm using the if. I'm only doing the password confirmation check if the column is actually changed, because no point in doing it if there's no change. With changes defined by that the incoming is the same as what's on the database. And looking over, how does that look? Let's just go take a quick look at the controller. So in Catalyst, so it's a little different from some of the Catalyst applications you've seen. I'll just go through it really quickly. So like when I hit register here, it's eventually calling this create method. Okay, this create method is expected to be a post, and it maps the incoming request to a body model, which is basically a class. Now I know with a lot of web frameworks, particularly, and also with Catalyst, the request object defines a parameters method that allows you to look at a hash reference of the parameters. I always find that that's like a security issue. I like to map my incoming parameters to an object rather than just use the keys. That's just my preference. So when the information comes in, the request stuff gets sent over and instantiates an object. I'm then getting it and sending it to the DBS class register field. So let's quick look at that. That's here. Okay, so it gets the data, it sets the columns, and in this case, with DBS class, depending on whether the object is already in the storage or not, right? So it puts it in, it goes and it does it. Now, here's something that ends up that's weird and different, perhaps. Generally, with with DBS class, if you call create, insert or update, or any of those methods, it tries to take the data that you put into your object and put it straight to the database, right? When you're using the Valiant glue with data or insert, or you call create or update separately, any of those modification methods, it will automatically run the validate. And the validation fails, it will not perform the insert or update unless you override it by saying force it to. Okay, so the default will be is it will first run validations, and if it finds that the object is in an invalid state, it will skip trying to put it into the database. So then what happens here, going back to the controller, it calls that method and it checks it. If it's valid, that means it was put into the database, you're all good to go. Then you know, all right, great. You know, we logged in. We can go to the to the show page. If not, it then returns the existing template, which is what we've been seeing here, right? Whenever I hit go, it just shows the template and displays the errors. Just looking quickly over here at the template. So I mentioned that although Valiant Validators doesn't do form generation, there's a form generation module that's part of it. So in this case, it's using the form generation module that gets the DBS class object. It knows about the values, how to get the values for the fields. It knows about the errors attribute, and it allows you basically to just build forms very quickly without having to do a lot of checking for errors and all sorts of things. So in this case, it's like the errors for method will look to see if there's any errors specifically for this attribute, the given name attribute. And if there are no errors, it doesn't display anything. If there are errors, it'll display the errors. And so what you end up with is a really simple flow where the data comes in from your user. It gets mapped to your Valiant enabled object, whether it's a moo or moose or a DBS class object. It gets mapped over to it. Validations get run. In the case of DBS class, it will automatically run those validations when you try to put it into the database. And then if it fails validations, it'll skip putting it in, but it will preserve the values that are associated with that DBS class object. So then you're allowed to use that DBS class object, excuse me, in your form to populate stuff. So it'll populate the values or the errors, as we've seen here. They're like it knows what I typed in. Okay. Let's go back to a few more slides, and then we'll call it a day. Let's present. Excuse me. Yeah, I was going to do this off of GitHub, but I decided to pull it down to my local computer. So one last quick feature. As we've seen, whether it's with DBS class or moo or moose, we've been using the validates keyword to associate validations with an attribute. And that's nice, but sometimes it might be ugly. So you're allowed to, with validations, if you're using moo or moose, it will automatically create an option associated with the options that are part of your attribute, so you can put the validations in line directly with your has declaration. Okay, so in this case, it's identical to the ones we were looking at over and over again, but instead of having it separate, it's sort of bunched together. So neither approach is better than the other. I've used both depending on what I'm doing. Like sometimes if you have like a smaller class or maybe a very large class with a lot of attributes, you might want to make it, make the validations like really close. so that you kind of see how it all goes together. Sometimes I have really complicated validations. I'd rather break them out and list them separately because it's just visually easier to understand. And I mean, I've mixed and matched in a project. So again, the option is there to do it that way if you either by preference or if you feel that it just makes the code easier to understand. The same thing goes with DBX class. You can put if you're using the DBX class glue, you can put the validates your validations directly into your column declaration, right? So instead of having separate, you can just put it all together. And this might be it might be nicer for like a lot of the simple validations that you put together. And of course, if you're the kind of person that likes to use DBX class candy, the glue that's built into the DBX glue for DBX class glue for Valiant understands the candy stuff and will it will then work the way you think it should work. It automatically will create the keywords. And I think I'm done a little bit early, so that leaves time for any questions if anybody's got any.